Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are not on the East Coast, and welcome everyone to this webinar on Growing Up in America, the Extent and Impacts of Discrimination on Young Children from Immigrant Families. My name is Randy Capps. I'll be the moderator today. I am Director of Research for U.S. Programs here at Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by three expert panelists: Christia Spears-Brown, Associate Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Kentucky; Jennifer Keyes-Adair, Assistant Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas at Austin; and Cecilia Ayon, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. Before we get started, I'd just like to provide a few logistics. I would like to remind everyone that the audio and PowerPoint from the webinar will be on our website later today. That website is migrationpolicy.org. Go to /events. The reports discussed on the webinar are available on our website. They've been released over the course of the past week or so, and you can see the shortened links on the slide that will direct you to the reports here on this slide. If you have any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. The best browsers to access the webinar are Google Chrome or Firefox. If you have any problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call information sent to you in the email confirming your attendance. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of the call, but it won't be a voice question and answer. Please submit your questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen, or you can send them to the host or email at events@migrationpolicy.org. In other words, you can send them by email or you can send them via the chat box. Now, today's presentations, again, it's about the impact of discrimination on young children of immigrants. This discussion takes place in an increasingly divisive climate of political rhetoric about immigrants and immigration policy. Most of the rhetoric has revolved around Latino immigrants and their children, but sometimes also around other groups. There have been calls for deportation of the predominantly Latino children of unauthorized immigrants, even if these children are U.S.-born citizens, for example. And we would note that over 90% of children of immigrants, including those with unauthorized parents, are in fact U.S. citizens. Now, discrimination against immigrants and against their children is nothing new. It's not just a function of the current political climate. So the purpose of the papers being presented here today is to review the state of the literature and the empirical evidence regarding discrimination and its impacts on young children. These papers follow from prior work published through MPI on young children and Black immigrants, which occurred in a published volume a couple of years ago. The three reports being presented on this webinar focus on forms of discrimination and their impacts with a focus on public schools. They differentiate, importantly, between broader structural forms of discrimination, such as segregation and unequal school funding, that the children may not notice, versus more personal forms, for instance, bullying or negative comments, that may have an immediate impact. And both the immediate and longer-term impacts of discrimination are discussed. The authors also provide some recommendations on how immigrant families and schools can respond to discrimination, to negate it or reduce its impacts. These three reports were previously presented and discussed at a workshop of scholars from a broad range of disciplines here at MPI, and the workshops, papers, and this webinar were supported by the Foundation for Child Development in New York City, and we would like to thank FCD very much for their support. Also, for everyone on this call, please stay tuned for future work on children in refugee families. We plan to release a series of papers on this topic later this fall. The first three, probably released in October, will be about education of refugee children, both abroad in countries of first asylum and in the U.S. after resettlement, with one of the papers focusing on refugee children from Syria. So with that, I would like to return to today's presentation, and the first presenter will be Christia Brown.
Hi, thanks Randy for the introduction. So let me start by kind of reiterating a point that was just mentioned, and something you'll definitely take away from these three papers is how multi-pronged discrimination really is, particularly as it affects immigrant children and the children of immigrants. So, as we mentioned, discrimination can affect immigrant children at the structural level in the form of harsh immigration policies, low-quality schools in neighborhoods where immigrant children live, or a lack of interpreters at those schools for the parents who speak only Spanish. But discrimination can also be very personal, and it can be directed at children. It can be these negative face-to-face interactions between an immigrant child and a teacher or a peer or someone in a store, for example, who has prejudices and biases against immigrants. And so the perspective I bring to this topic is as a developmental psychologist. In my field, we interview individual children about what their experiences are like. And we think that there's value in knowing what children actually think and perceive, what do they notice, because that can have long-range consequences for their development. So today I'm going to focus on how children themselves notice and experience discrimination. I'll talk today about whether children think to themselves, someone's treating me badly simply because I'm from another country, or because I have an accent, or because I look different. And then I'll talk about what are the psychological consequences, the academic, and the social consequences for children when they notice and experience this personal discrimination. We'll start with a discussion of just what types of discrimination children are noticing and at what ages are they noticing it. I think it happens much younger than many people are aware of. And we see that their experiences with discrimination are going to be influenced and affected by their own cognitive development and understanding of the world. And of the many ways that children may experience discrimination, they're most likely to detect or perceive it in school from their peers and their teachers. Then as children enter adolescence, they start encountering it and recognizing it more often in other public types of settings. But also keep in mind that while children are noticing these examples of personal discrimination, they're also impacted by the broader structural discrimination facing immigrant families: poverty, residential segregation and instability, and language difficulties. So I'm going to kind of talk about these milestones, but I'm going to break them down one by one. So what do children experience? Well, we know during elementary school from research with predominantly Latino immigrants, most frequently from Mexico, that around age 8 and 9, children become aware that there's negative stereotypes about immigrants in America, particularly Latino immigrants. And at the same time, they're developing some other important cognitive skills. They have perspective-taking skills that make it easier for them to understand that other people may have biases directed towards them. So that's a cognitive skill they're getting at about age 8 or 9. And it's at this age that children first start reporting discrimination from their peers at school. In one study of Mexican immigrant children in elementary school, over 60% of elementary school children reported experiencing at least one instance of discrimination from their peers, usually verbal insults. So on the slide in front of you, you see a couple of quotes that children provided, things like, they call me a lot of names because I'm Mexican, or in PE class, a lot of kids call me a beaner, and some people at school get called wetbacks. So at this age, what children are really noticing are really obvious, explicit examples of discrimination, but that are directed to them very face-to-face. Shortly after this, children develop more advanced cognitive skills. They begin to be aware that adults can also be unfair and wrong. You know, it's not always a fun moment for parents when kids start to realize that adults can be wrong. But with this cognitive advancement, you see children beginning to report that their teachers sometimes treat them unfairly for being an immigrant. So children at this age say things like, the teacher assumes I can't speak English, or I'm invisible in class. Research with middle school Latino immigrant kids shows in some samples that they're reporting that about half report that they've been graded unfairly. A quarter feel that they've been discouraged from joining advanced level classes. They feel that they've been disciplined harshly by their teachers. And many report that the teachers just have low expectations for them, often blaming their accents or perceived poor language skills. By the time children enter middle school, 7th, 8th grade, they have more advanced perspective-taking abilities. Then they start to recognize unfair treatment in more public places, particularly things like restaurants and stores. We see that more than half of Latino early adolescents interviewed in some studies report being hassled by store clerks and receiving poor service at restaurants because of their ethnicity. So here's a quote from one of the kids in one of our studies. When you go somewhere like a restaurant, sit down and wait for them, and a family came in, they attended their children instantly because they were white. As much more subtle and more difficult for children to detect is the more institutional types of discrimination. This requires more understanding of abstract concepts, but children do, by high school, begin noticing these forms of discrimination, things such as unfair hiring practices, things that might affect their families that they're picking up on it at home. So we see it moves from explicit to more subtle across childhood, but really children are noticing discrimination, targeting them as early as about age 8. So what are the consequences of all of these experiences with personal discrimination? There's a pretty substantial body of research that shows there are psychological consequences that in turn affect children's physiological and physical health that stem from discrimination. Perceiving discrimination has been associated with lower self-esteem for children, more hopelessness, greater levels of depression and anxiety and aggression. Some recent studies have looked at how Latino immigrant adolescents respond to the daily stress of discrimination, and they find that experiencing discrimination, the types of discrimination that children notice, produces a stress response in children similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Other studies have found an association between daily perceptions of discrimination and a greater overall output of cortisol. This is the hormone that's released in response to stress. And these physiological reactions are in turn associated with worse physical health outcomes. So keep in mind, this is all within the context of poor mental health services and medical care for immigrants. So even though worry and anxiety may seem like kind of the psychology fuzzy concepts, they can quite easily lead to real health problems as early as adolescence. Noticing and experiencing discrimination is also linked with performing worse in school and having more negative attitudes about school for children. Children who perceive discrimination in school, especially discrimination from their teachers, are likely to get lower grades, are more likely to drop out of high school, they're more likely to believe that doing well in school is unimportant and not useful, and do not find school as interesting and enjoyable. For immigrant students, perceiving discrimination from peers and teachers is also linked with their sense of school belonging. It makes them feel like they don't belong at school as much, and this in turn makes it more likely that they'll drop out of high school before graduation. And as we know, dropping out of high school virtually ensures limited earning potentials in the future. And an important point to make is in these studies we find even when we control for how well children are actually doing in school, their actual grades, those immigrant children who perceive and experience discrimination from teachers still feel worse about their academic abilities and feel a weaker sense of belonging at school. So this shows that how students are treated by their teachers does as much to shape their attitudes about their academic abilities as does their actual academic performance. And again, keeping in mind the broader context, this is all occurring within the context of schools, which often have fewer resources to begin with and often underqualified teachers. So there are also social consequences for children noticing and perceiving discrimination. We know that adolescents who perceive discrimination at school seem to feel less competent in interacting with their peers, which makes sense if peers are treating you negatively. You're going to feel less competent in that domain. We see that some adolescents begin engaging in risky behaviors, things such as drug use and vandalism, and they start hanging out with other deviant peers who are also engaging in risky behaviors. That or adolescents who are perceiving discrimination, because this discrimination involves being rejected by the peer group, some immigrant youth then report feeling socially isolated and segregated from their friends. And neither social outcome is positive. And both, I should say, predict poor mental health and dropping out of school. So with all of that said, although a majority of immigrant children and adolescents experience discrimination and pay these psychological, academic, and social costs, there are several factors that can help protect or buffer children from these costs. Children's ethnic identity, their schools, and their families can serve important roles in mitigating the effects of discrimination. So one thing research has been quite robust showing is that children are most protected from discrimination when they have a strong and positive ethnic identity. What does this mean? This means children, for example, who say, I am happy that I am Latino or Mexican American. And being Latino is an important part of who I am. So it's both feeling positive about your ethnicity and feeling like it's a central part of who you are. These children show very few links between discrimination and these negative consequences I mentioned. It seems that feeling proud about their group and feeling really connected to their group, especially when that group faces such strong stigma, is a really powerful buffer against that stigma. We know that families can really help foster these strong and positive ethnic identities. In research where immigrant parents talk to their children about having cultural pride and about helping them prepare for future discrimination, those children have stronger ethnic identities and seem to suffer fewer consequences of experiencing that later discrimination. And schools also play a really critical part in this. Research shows that teachers who have positive attitudes about diversity, who think that diversity enriches the classroom instead of being a burden they have to overcome, those